German Shepherd. Was about to fall into a deep ditch. What baby did next left everyone in tears. What happened next will shock you. A simple morning walk turned into something that made grown men cry and changed an entire community forever. Before we begin, please like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, and comment below where you're listening from. The shaky phone video started playing on social media at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. A German Shepherd, massive and beautiful, sliding down loose dirt toward what looked like a construction pit. The camera jerked wildly as someone screamed, "Arian, stop!" Then the footage cut to a 5-year-old boy on his belly near the edge of what appeared to be a dangerous drop. Text flashed across the screen. What he did next made grown men cry. The voice behind the camera whispered urgently, "Stay until the end." There's something about this dog that nobody knew, something that changes everything. But that video was just the ending. The real story started 3 hours earlier, when the morning sun painted Willowbrook's new housing development in golden light, and nobody had any idea their quiet Tuesday was about to become unforgettable. Amara adjusted her canvas bag and looked down at her son Arian, who was pushing his bright yellow toy dump truck along the sidewalk with intense concentration. The truck made tiny grinding sounds against the concrete, and Arian hummed a tune only he seemed to know. His dark hair caught the morning light as he bent low, making sure the truck's path was perfectly straight. "Look up, baby," Amara said softly. "See those birds?" Arian's eyes followed her finger to a cluster of sparrows dancing between the oak branches. "Blue," he whispered, though the birds were clearly brown. "Fast," Amara smiled. Arian spoke in whispers to most people, using 1 or 2 words at most. But his observations were always precise in their own way. The birds were fast, even if they weren't blue. His gentle nature meant he noticed things others missed. The construction site stretched ahead of them, half-finished homes rising like oversized doll houses. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, marking areas where work crews had been busy. Today felt different, though. Quieter. No hammering or shouting. Just the soft sound of Arian's truck wheels and distant traffic. "Truck goes work," Arian said, parking his toy near a pile of sand that had spilled from the construction area. "Just like the big trucks," Amara agreed. She checked her phone. 11:30 a.m., perfect timing for their walk to the park, past the new houses, then back home for lunch. That's when Bruno appeared. The German Shepherd came trotting around the corner of an unfinished house, tongue hanging out, tail wagging in that easy way dogs have when they're simply happy to be alive. His black and brown coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his ears perked forward with friendly curiosity. "Dog," Arian breathed, and for the first time, that morning, his voice carried excitement instead of just observation. Bruno approached slowly, as if he understood that sudden movements might scare the small human. His tail wagged lower now, respectful. When he reached Arian, he sat down and tilted his head, waiting for permission. Arian looked up at his mother. "Nice?" "He seems very nice," Amara said, though she kept a protective hand near Arian's shoulder. "But we don't know whose dog this is." Bruno wore a collar, she noticed. A simple brown leather collar with what looked like a small bell attached. The bell made the faintest chiming sound when Bruno moved his head. There was something almost musical about it, gentle and soothing. Arian extended one small hand toward Bruno's nose. The dog sniffed politely, then gave the tiniest lick to Arian's fingers. Arian giggled, actually giggled, something that happened maybe 3 times a week, if they were lucky. "Friend," Arian declared, and Bruno's tail wagged harder. Amara found herself relaxing. Bruno's temperament seemed incredibly gentle. His eyes were intelligent and kind, and he moved with the careful precision of a dog who understood he was much larger than the child in front of him. "Should we see if he has a tag?" Amara asked. She knelt down next to Bruno, who remained perfectly still while she examined his collar. There was indeed a tag, but it was scratched and worn. She could make out part of what might have been a phone number, but several digits were completely illegible. "Where do you live, boy?" she murmured. Bruno looked toward the construction site, then back at her, as if trying to communicate something important. His brown eyes held an almost human quality of wanting to be understood. Arian had returned to his truck, but now he was pushing it in circles around Bruno's paws. The dog watched with what could only be described as amusement, occasionally moving one large paw slightly when the truck needed to pass. "Be careful, Arian," Amara said. "Remember, gentle hands with animals." "Gentle," Arian agreed, his voice so soft it was barely audible. The scene was peaceful, perfect even. The kind of moment Amara would remember later and think about how simple happiness could be. A boy, his truck, a friendly dog, and morning sunshine. Bruno seemed content to be part of their small world, at least for now. Then Amara noticed the construction area more carefully. Several sections were marked off with orange cones and warning tape, but one area caught her attention. Near where they were standing, the ground had been excavated for what looked like drainage work. A deep trench ran parallel to the sidewalk, perhaps 6 feet deep, and lined with concrete on one side. "Stay close to me, Arian," she said, suddenly aware of how dangerous the site could be for a curious 5-year-old. But Arian was completely absorbed in his truck game, and Bruno seemed equally fascinated by the tiny vehicle's journey around his paws. The dog's tail continued its slow, happy wagging, and that little bell on his collar chimed softly with each movement. Birds called from the trees above them. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started up. A perfectly normal morning in a growing neighborhood where new families were building new lives. Amara pulled out her phone to check the time and frowned. The battery showed 3%. She'd forgotten to charge it overnight. She made a mental note to plug it in as soon as they got home. 5 more minutes, she told Arian. Then we head to the park. 5, he repeated, holding up his hand with fingers spread wide. Bruno shifted position slightly, lying down so he could be even closer to Arian's level. His movements were careful and deliberate, always checking that he wasn't interfering with the truck's path. The bell on his collar settled into silence. A distant rumble of thunder made them all look up. The sky had been clear when they'd started their walk, but now Amara could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Summer storms could come up quickly in this part of the country. "Maybe we should head back soon," she said, more to herself than to Arian. But Arian was now making truck sounds. Vroom, beep, beep. While Bruno watched with the patience of a saint. The dog's ears were relaxed, his breathing even. He seemed to understand that this was important work, this truck driving, and he was honored to be part of it. That's when the soccer ball came bouncing through the construction site. It appeared as if from nowhere, a black and white sphere rolling fast across the uneven ground. Someone must have kicked it from the street behind the houses, and now it was heading directly toward the drainage trench. Bruno's head snapped up immediately. His ears went forward, and every muscle in his body tensed with the instinct to chase. For a moment, he looked like what he was, a powerful, athletic dog with strong prey drive and lightning-fast reflexes. The ball bounced once, twice, then rolled to a stop right at the edge of the trench. Bruno stood up in one fluid motion, his training and instincts warring with his gentle nature. Chase the ball, but don't leave the small human. Retrieve, but stay protective. His body language showed the conflict clearly. "Bruno, stay," Amara said automatically, though she had no idea if he knew that command. The dog looked at her, then at Arian, then at the ball sitting so temptingly at the edge of danger. His tail had stopped wagging. The little bell on his collar made one small chime as he took a step toward the ball. "No, boy," Amara said more firmly. "Stay here." But Bruno was a dog, and dogs have been chasing balls for thousands of years. The instinct was written into his DNA, stronger than any voice command from a stranger. He took another step toward the trench, his eyes locked on the ball. Arian looked up from his truck, sensing the change in atmosphere. "Dog, go." "Bruno, please." "Stay," Amara tried again, but even as she said it, she knew it was too late. The German Shepherd bounded toward the ball with the joy and abandon of any dog who'd spotted the perfect toy. His powerful legs carried him across the rough ground in 3 quick strides. He reached the ball just as his momentum carried him too close to the edge. The ground at the rim of the trench wasn't solid earth. It was loose dirt and gravel left over from the excavation work. The moment Bruno's weight hit it, it started to shift and crumble. Amara watched in horror as Bruno scrambled for purchase, his claws scraping against the shifting debris. The ball tumbled into the trench below, forgotten now as the dog fought to keep from following it down. For a split second, it looked like he might make it. His powerful shoulders bunched as he tried to push himself back from the edge, but more dirt gave way, and suddenly Bruno was half dangling over the edge, his back legs kicking frantically in the air while his front paws clawed at the crumbling ground. His eyes were huge with fear and confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was just chasing a ball, doing what dogs do, and now he was suspended over a concrete-lined pit with no way to get back up. The little bell on his collar chimed desperately as he struggled. "Oh no! Oh no! Oh no!" Amara breathed, rushing toward the trench. But she stopped short when she saw how unstable the ground was. If she stepped too close, her weight might cause more collapse and send Bruno falling the rest of the way down. Behind her, Arian had gone completely still. His toy truck sat forgotten in the dirt as he processed what was happening to his new friend. The construction site, which had seemed so peaceful moments before, suddenly felt dangerous and isolated. No workers were visible anywhere, no sounds of machinery or voices calling instructions. Just the three of them, a woman, a small child, and a terrified dog clinging to the edge of disaster. Thunder rumbled again, closer now. The storm was coming faster than expected. Amara fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking. She needed to call for help. Call 911, call someone who could rescue Bruno before he fell. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank. 2% battery. And even as she watched, the percentage ticked down to 1%. The phone was going to die. The storm was approaching, and Bruno was running out of strength to hold on. Amara's mind raced as she stared at the 1% battery warning flashing on her phone screen. Every second counted now, and her lifeline to emergency services was about to disappear completely. She looked around desperately for any sign of the construction workers who should have been here, should have secured this area, should have prevented exactly this kind of accident from happening. The site was eerily quiet except for Bruno's panicked whimpering and the scrape of his claws against loose dirt. No hard hats visible anywhere. No orange safety vests. No trucks or equipment running. It was as if the entire crew had simply vanished, leaving behind their dangerous excavation with nothing more than a few orange cones and strips of caution tape that clearly weren't enough. "Hold on, Bruno," she called down to the dog, her voice trying to sound calmer than she felt. "We're going to get you out of there." But even as she said it, she could see more dirt crumbling away from the edge where Bruno clung. His powerful shoulders were already trembling with the effort of supporting his body weight. How long could a dog his size hold on like that? 5 minutes? 2 minutes? Less? Bruno looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and she could swear she saw understanding there. He knew he was in serious trouble. He knew the humans above him were his only hope, and he was trying so hard to be brave, trying not to panic, even as his strength slowly gave out. The little bell on his collar jingled softly each time he shifted his grip. Such a gentle, innocent sound in the middle of this crisis. It reminded Amara of wind chimes, or maybe a child's toy. Something peaceful and safe, the complete opposite of their current situation. She knelt carefully at what seemed like a safe distance from the unstable edge and tried to assess the situation more clearly. The trench was deeper than she'd initially thought, maybe 8 feet down to the concrete bottom. If Bruno fell that distance, he could break bones, suffer internal injuries, or worse. The sides of the excavation were steep and smooth, lined with concrete in some places and raw earth in others. There was no way he could climb out on his own, even if he made it down safely. "Mama?" Arian's small voice broke through her frantic thoughts. She turned to see her son standing exactly where she'd left him, still holding his toy dump truck, but his dark eyes were wide with concern. He was processing what was happening in that careful way of his, taking in details that adults might miss. "Bruno's scared," he said simply. "Yes, baby, Bruno is scared, but we're going to help him, okay?" Arian nodded solemnly and took a step closer to the edge, his truck clutched tightly in both hands. "No, Arian, stay back," Amara said quickly. "The ground isn't safe there." But Arian wasn't looking at the unstable dirt. He was studying the problem with the intense concentration he usually reserved for his truck games. His 5-year-old mind was working on something, processing the situation in ways that might not occur to an adult. Amara's phone buzzed with the final battery warning, then the screen went black. Dead. Her connection to emergency services, to help, to anyone who might have equipment or expertise to handle this situation. Gone. Think, she muttered to herself. She could try to find the construction office, but that might be several blocks away, and there was no guarantee anyone would be there during what appeared to be lunch break. She could run to the nearest house and ask to use their phone, but that would mean leaving Bruno alone, and she had the terrible feeling that he didn't have much time left. The wind picked up, sending dust swirling around the construction site. The storm clouds were definitely moving closer now. Dark and heavy, they promised the kind of sudden downpour that could turn a manageable crisis into a complete disaster. If it started raining hard, the already unstable ground around the trench would become even more treacherous. Bruno whimpered again, and Amara could see his claws slipping slightly. Fresh dirt cascaded down into the trench below him. His breathing was becoming labored from the strain of holding his own weight. "I need rope," she said aloud, looking around the construction site. "Or a ladder, or something." There had to be equipment somewhere. Construction sites were full of ropes, chains, pulleys, planks, all kinds of things that could be used for a rescue. But as she scanned the area, she realized that most of the tools and materials had been secured or locked away. The few scattered items she could see were either too small to be useful or too far away to reach without leaving Bruno. That's when she remembered her scarf. She was wearing a long knitted scarf, one of her favorites, that her mother had made for her last winter. It was thick and sturdy, meant to keep out the cold wind. Not exactly rescue equipment, but it was something. "Hang on, Bruno," she called again, unwinding the scarf from around her neck. "I'm going to try something." The scarf was about 6 feet long when fully extended, not nearly long enough to reach all the way down to Bruno, but maybe long enough to give him something to grab onto while she figured out the next step. She tied one end of the scarf around her wrist, making sure the knot was secure. Then she lay down flat on her stomach, the way she'd seen rescuers do in movies, distributing her weight to avoid putting too much pressure on any one spot near the edge. "Bruno, look at me," she called softly. The dog's ears perked up, and he turned his head toward her voice. His eyes were still wide with fear, but there was hope there too. He seemed to understand that she was trying to help. Slowly, carefully, Amara lowered the free end of the scarf toward Bruno. The colorful knitted fabric swayed in the breeze, just out of his reach. She scooted forward a few inches, her heart pounding as she felt the ground shift slightly beneath her. "Come on," she whispered. "Just a little closer." The scarf dangled about 2 feet above Bruno's head. He looked up at it, then back at her, as if asking what he was supposed to do. His front paws were occupied with maintaining his grip on the edge, and his position was too precarious for him to risk reaching for anything. "It's okay, boy," Amara said, trying to keep her voice calm and encouraging. "You can do this." She managed to lower the scarf, another few inches, until it was almost within Bruno's range. The dog looked at it longingly, his intelligent eyes calculating whether he could grab it without losing his balance entirely. Thunder rumbled overhead, much louder than before. The storm was getting close. Bruno made his decision. He lunged upward with his powerful neck, trying to catch the end of the scarf in his teeth. For a moment, it looked like he might succeed. The fabric brushed against his muzzle, and Amara felt a surge of hope. But the sudden movement shifted his weight, and more of the edge gave way. Amara watched in horror as a large chunk of dirt and loose rock broke free, taking Bruno with it. The scarf slipped from her hands as she instinctively pulled back from the collapsing ground. But this wasn't the ending she'd feared. Instead of falling straight down to the concrete bottom, Bruno landed on what appeared to be a narrow ledge about 4 feet down from where he'd been hanging. The excavation, she realized, was more complex than it had looked from above. There were different levels, probably related to drainage systems or utility lines. The ledge Bruno had landed on was maybe 2 feet wide, enough for him to stand, but barely. And as Amara peered down into the trench, she could see that this wasn't the bottom. Below Bruno's ledge, the excavation dropped at least another 6 feet into what looked like an old storm drain system. "Bruno!" she called. "Are you hurt?" The dog shook himself and looked up at her. He seemed shaken, but uninjured. However, his situation had gone from desperate to nearly impossible. The ledge he was on was too narrow for him to move around comfortably, and the walls above and below him were sheer concrete or packed earth. There was no way he could climb out on his own. Worse yet, Amara could see a dark stain spreading along Bruno's left hind leg. Blood. The falling debris or rough concrete had cut him somewhere. "It's okay, boy," she called down. "We're still going to get you out." But privately, she was starting to panic. Her phone was dead. Bruno was trapped even more securely than before. He was injured, and the storm was approaching fast. How was she supposed to handle this on her own? That's when Arian appeared beside her. Her son had crept up while she was focused on Bruno, moving with the quiet stealth that 5-year-olds sometimes possess. Now he was lying flat on his stomach next to her, his toy dump truck positioned carefully beside him, peering down into the trench with serious concentration. "Arian, get back," Amara said automatically. "It's not safe here." But Arian wasn't listening to safety warnings right now. He was studying the situation with that intense focus of his, the same expression he got when he was working out how to make his truck navigate around obstacles in their backyard. "Mama," he said quietly, "truck has hook." Amara looked at the toy dump truck her son was indicating. It was one of his favorites, a detailed replica of a real construction vehicle, complete with tiny working parts. And yes, there was indeed a small hook attachment on the back, the kind used for towing or pulling small trailers in the world of toy construction. "That's very nice, baby, but—" "Hook," Arian repeated, more insistently this time. He was pointing not just at the truck, but at his shoelaces. Amara followed his gaze and suddenly understood what her 5-year-old was trying to tell her. Arian's sneakers had long, sturdy laces, the kind she always double-knotted to make sure they wouldn't come undone during his active play. And his toy truck, while small, was made of solid metal and plastic. It had some weight to it. "You want to tie your shoelace to the truck?" she asked. Arian nodded seriously. "Hook for Bruno." The idea was so simple it was almost brilliant. Use the weighted truck as a kind of grappling hook, with the shoelace as the line. If they could get it down to Bruno's level and somehow hook onto his collar, they might be able to help pull him up, or at least give him something to hold onto while they figured out the next step. "That's very smart thinking, Arian," Amara said, her respect for her son's problem-solving abilities growing by the minute. "But I don't think the shoelace is long enough." Arian was already untying his left shoe with the careful concentration he brought to everything. The lace was indeed long, probably about 4 feet when fully extended. Combined with the remaining length of her scarf, it might just be enough to reach Bruno on his ledge. "We try," Arian said simply. As Amara helped her son thread the shoelace through the tiny hook on his dump truck, she found herself amazed by the clarity of his thinking. While she'd been panicking about calling for help and finding professional rescue equipment, Arian had calmly assessed the resources they actually had available and come up with a practical solution. The storm clouds were definitely closer now. She could feel the atmospheric pressure changing, that heavy feeling that comes right before a significant weather event. They were running out of time to try anything else. "Okay," she said, tying the other end of the shoelace to her scarf. "Let's see if this works." The improvised rescue line was awkward but functional. The toy truck would serve as both a weight to help control the descent and, hopefully, a hook that could catch on Bruno's collar or harness. The shoelace and scarf combination gave them just enough length to reach the ledge where Bruno was trapped. Amara positioned herself carefully at the edge, once again lying flat to distribute her weight. Arian settled beside her, his small hands helping to hold the makeshift rope. "Bruno," she called down to the dog, "we're going to try to help you. Stay very still, okay?" Bruno looked up at them with those intelligent brown eyes, his head tilted slightly as if he was listening carefully to her. Instructions. His tail gave a weak wag of acknowledgement, and the little bell on his collar chimed softly. Slowly, carefully, Amara began to lower the toy truck toward Bruno's ledge. The yellow metal gleamed in the gray light from the storm clouds, spinning slightly as it descended. The shoelace and scarf combination held together well, and the weight of the truck helped guide it down in a relatively straight line. Bruno watched the approaching truck with intense concentration, his canine instincts probably telling him that this small yellow object was somehow connected to his potential rescue. His nose twitched as he tracked its descent, but he remained perfectly still on his narrow ledge. "Almost there," Amara murmured, playing out more of the line. The truck came to rest about 6 inches from Bruno's front paws, close, but not quite close enough for him to reach it without risking his balance on the narrow ledge. "Bruno, can you get it?" Amara called. The dog stretched his neck forward as far as he dared, but the truck remained just out of range. Bruno looked up at them, then back at the truck, clearly understanding what they wanted him to do, but unable to safely accomplish it from his current position. Arian made a small, frustrated sound next to her. His clever plan was so close to working, but they needed just a few more inches. "Wait," Amara said, studying the angles. "What if we swing it to him?" She began to move the line back and forth in small arcs, creating a pendulum motion that brought the truck closer to Bruno with each swing. On the third swing, the truck's hook caught momentarily on the edge of Bruno's collar before bouncing away again. "Almost," she said excitedly. "One more time." But just as she was preparing for another swing, she heard the sound that made her heart sink. A low rumble, different from thunder, was coming from somewhere upstream in the drainage system. It was the sound of water moving through pipes, rushing toward their location with increasing volume and force. Bruno heard it too. His ears perked up in alarm, and he shifted nervously on his ledge, causing small pieces of debris to fall into the deeper part of the trench below him. "What is that?" Amara asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. The rumble was getting louder, and now she could hear the unmistakable sound of water rushing through the storm drain system that connected to the excavation where Bruno was trapped. Somewhere upstream, either the storm had already started, or there was a scheduled water release, or a pipe had burst. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that water was coming, and when it arrived, Bruno's narrow ledge would be completely submerged. "Oh no," she breathed, her rescue attempt suddenly taking on a much more urgent timeline. She could see the panic in Bruno's eyes as he heard the approaching water. Dogs have excellent hearing, and he could probably tell better than she could how much. Time they had left. His breathing became rapid and shallow, and he pressed himself against the concrete wall as if he could somehow climb higher through sheer force of will. The little bell on his collar was jingling constantly now as he trembled. "It's okay, Bruno," Amara called, trying to keep her voice calm despite her own rising panic. "We're going to get you out right now." She swung the truck again, more aggressively this time. The hook caught Bruno's collar and held for a moment, but when she tried to pull, the connection wasn't secure enough. The truck slipped free, and Bruno actually lost his footing slightly from the tug. "Careful, Mama," Arian said quietly. His small hand touched her arm. Scared Bruno more. Her son was right. In her panic about the approaching water, she was being less careful, less gentle. That wasn't going to help anyone. "You're right," she said, taking a deep breath. "We need to be calm and careful." But the sound of rushing water was getting noticeably louder, and she estimated they had maybe 2 or 3 minutes before it reached Bruno's location. That's when they heard the footsteps, running footsteps, getting closer fast. Someone was coming around the corner of the nearest half-built house, moving with urgency. Amara looked up from the trench to see a man in his 30s jogging toward them, his face creased with concern. "What's happening here?" he called out as he approached. He was wearing jeans and a leather jacket, with a motorcycle helmet tucked under one arm. His dark hair was slightly messy from the helmet, and his eyes immediately went to the excavation, where the sounds of distress were coming from. "There's a dog trapped down there," Amara said quickly, pointing toward the trench. "And we can hear water coming through the storm drains. I think he's going to be flooded out." The man, Omar, he introduced himself quickly, dropped his helmet and moved to the edge of the excavation with the confident movements of someone who was used to emergency situations. He took one look at Bruno on his narrow ledge and immediately grasped the severity of the situation. "How long has he been down there?" Omar asked, already scanning the construction site for anything that might be useful. "About 10 minutes, Amara replied. "Maybe less. But that water sound is getting louder." Omar nodded grimly. He could hear it too now, the rush of water through the underground drainage system, getting closer with each passing second. His expression showed he understood they were dealing with minutes, not hours. "What have you tried so far?" he asked, noticing the improvised rope made from scarf and shoelace that was still dangling into the trench. "My son had the idea to use his toy truck as a hook," Amara explained quickly. "We almost got it attached to the dog's collar, but we ran out of time." Omar looked at Arian with genuine respect. "That's brilliant thinking, buddy. Really smart." Arian ducked, his head shyly, but held up his dump truck to show Omar the tiny hook attachment. "For Bruno," he said quietly. "Bruno, that's the dog's name?" Omar asked. "We just met him this morning," Amara admitted, "but that's what's on his collar tag." Omar was already moving, jogging toward a cluster of construction materials that had been left near one of the unfinished houses. "I saw some supplies over here when I parked my bike. Maybe we can find something more substantial than a toy truck." But even as he said it, the sound of rushing water grew noticeably louder. Whatever was coming through the storm system was moving fast, and they could all hear it now. Bruno heard it too. His ears were pinned back against his head, and he was pressing himself as far back against the concrete wall as his narrow ledge would allow. "How much time do you think we have?" Amara called to Omar. He paused in his search through the construction materials and listened carefully to the approaching water. "Based on the sound, maybe 2 minutes, 3 at the most." 2 minutes to save a life. Amara felt her heart rate spike even higher. That's when another voice called out from behind them. "Hey, what's going on over there?" They turned to see a teenage girl running toward them from the direction of the bus stop. She was wearing a school backpack and had obviously been heading home when she noticed the commotion. Her long black hair streamed behind her as she jogged over, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as she took in the scene. "There's a dog trapped in the construction pit," Omar explained quickly as the girl, Leah, she said breathlessly, joined their small group. "We need to get him out before the storm drain floods." Leah immediately pulled out her phone. "I'll call 911. "Already tried," Amara said. "My phone died, but yes, please call them." Leah was already dialing, her fingers moving quickly across the screen, but after a moment she frowned and looked at her phone display. "I'm not getting a signal," she said, holding the phone up and moving to different positions. "Sometimes this area has dead spots because of all the construction equipment." Omar had found a coil of rope among the construction supplies, but when he examined it more closely, he shook his head in frustration. "This is climbing rope, really thin stuff. It might hold a person, but I don't know if it's strong enough to pull a dog that size." The sound of water was definitely getting closer. Bruno was whimpering continuously now, a soft, heartbreaking sound that made it clear he knew something terrible was about to happen. "We have to try something," Amara said. "Even if the rope isn't perfect, maybe we can at least give him something to hold on to." But Arian, who had been quietly observing the growing group of adults, suddenly tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "loud scares." Amara looked down at her son, not immediately understanding what he meant. Then she followed his gaze to Bruno, and suddenly she got it. All of their voices, their urgent discussions and planning, the general commotion of more people arriving. It was making Bruno more nervous, not less. Dogs picked up on human anxiety, and right now the humans were radiating panic and stress. Bruno could sense their fear, and it was amplifying his own. "You're absolutely right," Amara said softly. She turned to Omar and Leah. "We need to keep our voices down, calm and quiet. He's already terrified." Omar immediately moderated his tone. "Good point. Dogs respond to our energy." Leah nodded and moved more slowly, deliberately projecting calm, even though Amara could see the worry in her eyes. The strange thing was, as soon as the 3 adults started moving and speaking more quietly, Bruno's whimpering decreased. His ears came forward slightly, and while he was still obviously frightened, he seemed to be listening more carefully to what they were doing, rather than just reacting to their panic. "Okay," Omar said quietly, holding up the thin rope he'd found. "This isn't ideal, but it's what we have. The question is how to get it attached to his collar securely enough to hold his weight." Arian held up his dump truck again. "Hook," he said simply. Leah looked at the toy with the serious consideration it deserved. "Actually, that might work better than a regular rope. If we can hook his collar, we're distributing the force differently than if we're just pulling on it." Omar studied the toy truck, turning it over in his hands. "The hook is small, but it's metal, and if we're not trying to lift his full weight, just give him something to help him climb." "I could try to get down there," Leah volunteered. "I'm pretty light, and I do rock climbing with my dad sometimes." "Absolutely not," Omar said immediately. "That edge is completely unstable. You saw what happened when the dog stepped on it." The water sound was getting much louder now. They could actually see ripples and movement in the deeper part of the excavation below Bruno's ledge. The water was arriving. "We're out of time for complicated plans," Amara said urgently. "We try the truck hook, right now." She grabbed the improvised rope, shoelace tied to scarf tied to thin climbing rope that Omar had found. It was a ridiculous combination that looked like it had been put together by children playing rescue games. But it was what they had. "Bruno," she called down softly. "Good boy, we're going to help you." The dog looked up at her with those expressive brown eyes. Water was starting to pool around the bottom of the deeper excavation, just a few feet below his ledge. Soon, it would start rising. Amara lowered the truck again, this time with the benefit of the additional rope length that Omar had provided. The truck descended smoothly, swaying slightly in the breeze that was picking up as the storm approached. Little to the left, Omar coached quietly, watching the angles from a different position. Arian, lying on his stomach next to his mother, was following the truck's descent with intense concentration. "There," he whispered, "right there." The truck was now hovering about 6 inches from Bruno's head, close enough that he could see it clearly, close enough that the hook was within his reach if he stretched. "Come on, boy," Leah said softly. "You can do it?" Bruno looked at the truck, then up at the humans above him, then back at the truck. He seemed to understand that this strange yellow object was somehow connected to his rescue, but he was still afraid to move on his narrow ledge. The water below was definitely rising now. What had been a dry concrete bottom was now covered with several inches of flowing water, and the level was climbing steadily. "Bruno," Arian said, his voice barely audible but somehow carrying clearly down into the excavation. "Please." There was something in the way her 5-year-old son said, that one word that cut through all the complexity of the situation. Not a command, not urgency, just a simple, heartfelt request from one living being to another. Bruno looked up at Arian, and something shifted in the dog's expression. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with determination. He seemed to gather his courage, the way dogs do when they decide to trust the humans who are trying to help them. Slowly, carefully, Bruno stretched his neck toward the dangling truck. His movement was controlled and deliberate, maintaining his balance on the ledge while reaching for what might be his salvation. The truck hook caught on the edge of his collar. "Got it!" Omar said quietly, but his voice was tense with excitement. "Don't pull yet," Amara warned. "Make sure it's secure." She tested the connection gently, feeling through the rope for any indication that the hook might slip or that Bruno's collar might break under pressure. The connection felt solid, but she had no idea how much weight it would actually hold. The water was now lapping at the bottom edge of Bruno's ledge. In another minute or two, it would start flooding the narrow platform where he was trapped. "We have to try it now," Omar said. "Wait," Leah interjected. "What if the collar breaks? Or what if pulling on it hurts his neck?" It was a good point. Dog collars weren't designed to bear the full weight of the animal in a rescue situation, and Bruno, while not enormous, was still a substantial German shepherd who probably weighed 70 or 80 pounds. "We're not trying to lift him completely," Amara said, thinking through the mechanics. "We're just giving him help. If he can use his own strength to climb, while we provide some assistance with the rope." "Like belaying and rock climbing," Leah said, understanding immediately. "He does most of the work, we just help." Arian, who had been listening to this discussion with his characteristic quiet attention, suddenly spoke up. "Bruno's smart," he said simply. "He knows." And looking down at the dog, Amara realized her son was right. Bruno's expression had changed. He was no longer just a terrified animal trapped in a bad situation. Now he looked like a dog who understood that the humans above him had a plan, and that he was going to need to be part of that plan. The German shepherd's ears were forward, alert and focused. His breathing had steadied. He was ready to try. The water reached his ledge. At first it was just a trickle, flowing over the edge and wetting Bruno's paws. But they could all see that it was rising fast. In another 30 seconds, the ledge would be submerged, and Bruno would be forced to swim in a concrete-lined channel with nowhere to climb out. "Now," Omar said quietly. "We have to do this now." Amara felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was holding the rope that connected to Bruno's only chance of escape. One wrong move, one moment of panic or poor judgment, and they could make things worse instead of better. "Bruno," she called down softly. "When I count to 3, you climb. We'll help you. 1... Bruno shifted his position slightly, gathering his powerful hindquarters beneath him like a sprinter preparing for a race. 2... The dog's eyes met hers across the distance between them. In that moment, Amara felt a connection that transcended species. They were two living beings who understood each other completely. She was asking him to trust her with his life, and he was saying yes. 3. Bruno launched himself upward with all the power his breed was known for. His powerful legs drove him off the flooded ledge as Amara, Omar, and Leah pulled on the improvised rope with everything they had. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like it might actually work. Bruno's front paws scrabbled against the concrete wall of the excavation, finding small holds and cracks that gave him purchase. The truck hook held firm on his collar, and the combined strength of the humans above was enough to keep him from falling back down. But then physics and engineering reality asserted themselves. The improvised rope, stressed beyond its design limits, began to fail. Not all at once. That might have been easier to deal with. Instead, it failed gradually, stretched and frayed in multiple places as the different materials, shoelace, scarf, climbing rope, each responded differently to the stress. Amara felt it happening through her hands. The rope was stretching, the knots were slipping, and Bruno's upward progress slowed and then stopped about halfway up the wall of the excavation. "It's not going to hold," Omar said grimly, feeling the same thing through his section of the rope. Bruno seemed to sense the failure too. His powerful claws scraped against concrete and packed earth, but he couldn't get enough purchase to continue climbing without the rope's assistance. And the rope was becoming less and less reliable with each passing second. Worse yet, the water below had completely covered his ledge now and was continuing to rise. If he fell back down, he'd be falling into several feet of flowing water with concrete walls all around him. Swimmings wouldn't help him escape. It would only delay the inevitable. That's when the most unexpected thing happened. Just as the rope was about to snap completely, just as Bruno was starting to slide back down the wall, just as it looked like their rescue attempt was going to end in disaster, the ground beneath them gave way again. But this time, instead of making things worse, the collapse created an opportunity. A large section of the excavation wall, undermined by the flowing water below and weakened by the earlier collapse, suddenly sheared away. Instead of a sheer drop, there was now a sloped section of broken concrete and earth that led from the water level almost to the top of the excavation. It happened so fast that none of them had time to react. One moment Bruno was clinging to a vertical wall with a failing rope, and the next moment he was scrambling up a rough but manageable slope of debris. The truck hook finally slipped from his collar as he reached the top, and Bruno tumbled onto solid ground in a heap of wet fur and exhausted breathing. For a moment, nobody moved. The rescue had happened so suddenly, in such an unexpected way, that they all just stared at Bruno, lying safely on the grass next to the construction site. Then Arian broke the spell. "Bruno okay?" he asked quietly, crawling toward the exhausted dog on his hands and knees. Bruno lifted his head and looked at the little boy who had started this whole rescue effort with nothing but a toy truck and a shoelace. The dog's tail gave a weak wag, and the little bell on his collar chimed softly. "He's okay," Amara said, her voice shaky with relief and leftover adrenaline. "I think he's really okay." But even as she said it, she noticed the dark stain on Bruno's left hind leg had gotten worse. The cut from the falling debris was deeper than she'd initially thought, and it was still bleeding steadily. Omar noticed it too. "He needs medical attention. That cut looks like it might need stitches." Leah was already pulling out her phone again. "I'll try 911 again, or maybe I can find a vet clinic." But before she could make the call, they heard another sound that made them all look up in alarm. Heavy footsteps coming fast, and a voice, loud and angry, shouting something about trespassing and liability and people who didn't belong on construction sites. A man in a hard hat and fluorescent safety vest was striding toward them across the construction site, his face red with anger and his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded as he approached. "This is a restricted construction zone. You people have no business being here." The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades working outdoor construction jobs. His name tag read, Site Supervisor, Jake Miller. His expression made it clear that he viewed their presence here as a serious problem that needed to be solved immediately. "Sir, there was an emergency," Amara began, trying to keep her voice calm and respectful. The dog was trapped in the excavation, and we were trying to... I don't care what you were trying to do, Miller interrupted. This site is off limits to unauthorized personnel, period. You could have been seriously injured, and then who do you think would be responsible? Who do you think gets sued when civilians get hurt on my construction site? Omar stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. The dog would have drowned if we hadn't acted. The storm drain was flooding the excavation. Miller's expression didn't soften. That's not my problem. Dogs shouldn't be on the construction site in the first place, and neither should you people. Leah looked up from her phone, where she'd been searching for veterinary clinics. We're not trying to cause trouble. We just saved a life. You caused a bigger mess than you solved, Miller shot back. Look at this excavation now. Look at all the damage. That's going to cost thousands of dollars to repair, and it's going to set our schedule back by at least a week. It was true that the excavation looked dramatically different than it had an hour ago. The wall collapse that had ultimately saved Bruno had also created a significant amount of damage to what had presumably been carefully planned construction work. But Amara found herself getting angry at Miller's priorities. A living creature was about to die, she said, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to stay calm. Are you seriously saying that your construction schedule is more important than that? I'm saying that this is a workplace safety issue, Miller replied. What you people did was dangerous and irresponsible. Someone could have been killed. Arian, who had been quietly petting Bruno throughout this confrontation, suddenly looked up at the angry man. Bruno's scared, he said in his small, clear voice. Miller looked down at the 5-year-old and seemed to notice him for the first time. His expression shifted slightly, uncertainty replacing some of the anger. Well, the dog is fine now, he said, his tone slightly less harsh. But you all need to leave this site immediately. He's injured, Omar pointed out, indicating Bruno's bleeding leg. He needs medical attention. Miller glanced at the blood on Bruno's leg, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked genuinely concerned rather than just angry. How bad is it? He asked, kneeling down to get a better look at the wound. As he examined Bruno's injury, his entire demeanor began to change. The dog lay still and calm under Miller's inspection, seeming to sense that this new human was trying to help rather than threaten. It's not life-threatening, Miller said after a moment, but you're right that it needs professional attention. There's a veterinary clinic about 10 minutes from here. He stood up and looked at the small group of rescuers with an expression that was much more complicated than simple anger. Look, he said finally, I understand you were trying to help, and I'm glad the dog is okay, but this site should have been secured better. That excavation should have had proper barriers. It was as close to an admission of responsibility as they were likely to get. Thunder rumbled overhead, much closer now, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The raindrops were light at first, just a gentle pattering that seemed almost peaceful after the intensity of the rescue. But everyone could see the dark clouds gathering overhead, heavy with the promise of a serious storm. Within minutes, this gentle sprinkle would turn into something much more substantial. Miller looked up at the sky with the experienced eye of someone who had worked construction in all kinds of weather. We need to get out of here, he said. This is going to be a big one. But as the small group prepared to leave the construction site, more people began to arrive. A jogger who had seen the commotion from the street came over to see what was happening. A woman walking her own dog paused when she noticed Bruno's injury and asked if she could help. 2 teenagers on bikes stopped to see if everything was okay. Within minutes, what had started as a private rescue effort involving just Amara and Arian had become a small crowd of concerned neighbors and passers-by, all drawn by the universal human instinct to help when someone, or some animal, is in trouble. But the most interesting thing was how they all seemed to instinctively understand Arian's earlier observation about noise and fear. Maybe it was the way Amara kept her voice low and calm when she explained what had happened. Maybe it was Omar's quiet competence as he organized people into small groups with specific tasks. Maybe it was just the sight of a 5-year-old boy sitting cross-legged in the grass, gently petting an injured dog while rain began to fall around them. Whatever the reason, the growing crowd maintained an atmosphere of quiet focus rather than chaotic excitement. People spoke in low tones, moved slowly and deliberately, and seemed to take their cues from Bruno himself about how to behave. The German Shepherd, for his part, seemed almost amazed by the number of humans who had appeared to help him. His tail wagged weakly from his position lying in the grass, and his eyes tracked from person to person with an expression of grateful bewilderment. "Has anyone been able to reach a veterinarian?" asked Sarah, the woman with the dog. Her own golden retriever sat patiently beside her, occasionally sniffing in Bruno's direction, but maintaining a respectful distance. Leah held up her phone. "I found a clinic that's open, but they said they can't do house calls. We need to bring him there. I have an SUV," offered Marcus, the jogger who had stopped to help. "If we can get him into the back seat, I can drive him there right now." But Bruno, despite his exhaustion and injury, was still a large, powerful dog. Moving him safely was going to require some planning, especially since they didn't know if he had any internal injuries from his fall or other problems that weren't immediately visible. "Let me take a closer look at him first," Miller said, surprising everyone by kneeling down beside Bruno with the careful movements of someone who knew how to assess injury. The site supervisor ran his hands gently along Bruno's legs and ribs, checking for obvious signs of breaks or sprains. Bruno tolerated the examination with remarkable patience, seeming to understand that Miller was trying to help. "He seems okay except for that cut on his leg," Miller concluded after a thorough check. "Nothing feels broken, and he's alert and responsive, but that wound definitely needs cleaning and probably stitches." "Should we make a stretcher or something?" asked one of the teenagers, "in case moving hurts him?" It was a thoughtful suggestion, but before anyone could answer, Bruno solved the problem himself by slowly getting to his feet. The big dog swayed slightly as he stood, clearly tired and sore from his ordeal, but he was able to bear weight on all four legs. The cut on his hind leg was still bleeding, but it didn't seem to be affecting his mobility significantly. Most remarkably, once he was standing, Bruno walked directly over to Arian. The 5-year-old had been sitting quietly in the grass, still holding his toy dump truck, watching the adults discuss rescue plans with his characteristic intense attention. When Bruno approached him, Arian's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "Bruno, okay," he said softly, reaching up to touch the dog's nose. Bruno lowered his head so that Arian could pet him more easily, and the little bell on his collar chimed gently with the movement. The sound seemed to have a calming effect on everyone present, a small, sweet note of normalcy in the midst of the crisis. "I think he's trying to say thank you," Sarah observed, watching the interaction between boy and dog with obvious emotion. "No," Arian said quietly, still petting Bruno's head. "He's saying we friends now?" The simple statement hit everyone present with unexpected force. After everything they had just been through together, the fear, the desperate rescue attempts, the community effort to save a life, the idea that Bruno and Arian had formed a genuine friendship felt both natural and profound. But the rain was picking up now, transitioning from light drops to a steady drizzle that promised to get much worse very soon. "We really need to get him to the vet," Omar said, looking up at the darkening sky. "And we all need to get out of this weather." Marcus had already jogged back to get his SUV, and they could hear the engine approaching as he drove across the grass toward their location. The golden retriever belonging to Sarah started getting excited by the sound of the car, but Bruno remained calm and focused on Arian. "Will you come with us?" Amara asked Miller, surprising herself by extending the invitation to the man who had been yelling at them just minutes earlier. Miller looked equally surprised by the offer. "I should probably stay here and deal with the site, document what happened, figure out how to secure the area properly." But then he looked down at Bruno, still standing patiently next to Orion despite his injury, and his expression softened. "Actually," he said, "I think I should come along. This whole situation happened because our safety protocols weren't adequate. The least I can do is make sure the dog gets proper medical care." It was a significant admission of responsibility, and everyone recognized it as such. The fact that Miller was willing to acknowledge the site's safety failures and take personal responsibility for ensuring Bruno's welfare said something important about his character. Marcus pulled up in a dark blue SUV with the back seats already folded down to create a flat cargo area. "I put some old towels back there," he called through the open window, "in case he's wet or muddy." The next challenge was getting Bruno into the vehicle. Despite his apparent friendliness, he was still a large, injured dog who might react unpredictably to being lifted or moved in ways that caused pain. But once again, Bruno seemed to understand exactly what was needed. When Marcus opened the back of the SUV, Bruno walked over and sniffed at the opening. Then, moving slowly and carefully, he jumped up into the cargo area on his own, settling himself on the towels with a soft sigh. "Smart dog," Marcus said admiringly. "He knows we're trying to help him." Arian appeared beside the SUV, still carrying his dump truck. "Bruno, I come too?" Amara looked at the group of adults, realizing that they hadn't really discussed the logistics of who was going to the veterinary clinic. She needed to be with Arian, obviously. But did it make sense for all of them to go? "Why don't we organize this?" Omar suggested. "Marcus can drive. Amara and Arian should definitely go. Bruno seems most comfortable with them. Miller wants to take responsibility, so he should come too. The rest of us can exchange contact information and check in later to see how everything turns out." It was a practical plan that made sense for everyone. Sarah gave Amara her phone number and asked to be updated on Bruno's condition. Leah and the teenagers also wanted to stay informed about how the story ended. In the space of an hour, a group of complete strangers had become a small community united by their shared concern for one injured dog. But as they were preparing to leave, Omar noticed something that made him pause. "Has anyone thought about who's going to pay for the veterinary treatment?" he asked quietly. It was a practical question that had been lost in the immediate crisis. Veterinary emergency care could be expensive, especially if Bruno needed surgery or extensive treatment. None of them knew who owned the dog or whether the owner would be able to cover the costs. Miller stepped forward immediately. "The construction company will handle it," he said firmly. "This happened because of inadequate safety measures on our site. We're responsible." "Are you sure you can make that decision?" Amara asked. "Won't you need to check with your supervisors or insurance company?" Miller's jaw tightened slightly. "I'll handle it with my bosses later. Right now, the important thing is getting the dog treated." It was another moment that revealed something significant about Miller's character. He was willing to put his own job on the line to ensure that Bruno received proper medical care, even though he could probably have found ways to avoid responsibility. The rain was definitely getting heavier now, and they needed to get moving. "Let's go," Marcus said, starting the engine. "The clinic closes at 6, and it's already past 4. Amara and Arian climbed into the back seat, while Miller took the front passenger seat. Bruno lay quietly in the cargo area, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes alert and watching everything that was happening around him. As they drove away from the construction site, Amara realized that Arian had been unusually quiet during the past few minutes. Usually after exciting or stressful events, he had questions or observations to share. But now he was just sitting in his car seat, holding his dump truck and looking out the window. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked softly. Arian turned to look at her with those serious dark eyes. "Bruno scared before," he said, "but not scared now." "How can you tell?" Arian pointed toward the cargo area where Bruno was lying, ears not back, tail not tight, breathing slow. Amara followed her son's gaze and realized he was absolutely right. Bruno's body language had changed completely from the terrified animal they had rescued from the flooding excavation. His ears were relaxed, his tail was loose, and his breathing was indeed slow and steady. "You're very good at reading dogs," Miller said, turning around to look at Arian with newfound respect. "That's not an easy skill, even for adults." "Animals talk different," Arian said simply. "Not words, but still talking." It was perhaps the longest sentence Amara had ever heard her son speak to a stranger, and it revealed a level of insight that surprised even her. Arian's quiet observations weren't just random comments. They reflected a deep understanding of nonverbal communication that most people never developed. Marcus navigated through the increasingly heavy rain, his windshield wipers working hard to keep the view clear. "The clinic should be just a few more blocks," he said. "Hopefully we can get there before this storm really hits." But even as he said it, they could all see lightning flickering in the clouds ahead of them. The storm was going to be significant, and they were driving directly into it. "Maybe we should have waited," Amara said, watching the lightning with concern. "No," Miller said firmly. "The dog needed medical attention now, not after the storm passed. We made the right choice." As if to confirm Miller's statement, Bruno lifted his head slightly and looked toward the front of the vehicle. For a moment, his eyes met Amara's in the rearview mirror, and she saw something there that surprised her. Trust. Despite everything he had been through, the fear, the injury, the rescue by strangers, Bruno's expression showed complete confidence in the humans who were taking care of him. He seemed to understand that they were bringing him somewhere safe, somewhere he would be helped. "There it is," Marcus said, pointing to a small building with a sign reading Willowbrook Animal Hospital. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 cars besides theirs, but as they pulled into the parking space closest to the entrance, they realized they had another problem. The rain was now coming down hard enough that they would all be soaked within seconds of leaving the vehicle. More importantly, getting Bruno from the car to the clinic entrance would mean exposing his injury to the driving rain, which could cause further complications. "Wait here," Miller said, opening his door. "Let me talk to the clinic staff. Maybe they have an umbrella or tarp we can use." He sprinted through the rain to the clinic entrance, his fluorescent safety vest making him highly visible even in the storm. Through the large windows, they could see him talking animatedly to someone at the front desk. A few minutes later, he emerged from the building, accompanied by a woman in scrubs who was carrying a large umbrella and what appeared to be a waterproof blanket. "Dr. Hassan," the woman introduced herself as she approached the SUV. "We're going to get your dog inside and comfortable as quickly as possible." Working together, the group managed to create a protected pathway from the vehicle to the clinic entrance. Marcus and Miller held the umbrella and blanket to shield Bruno from the rain, while Dr. Hassan guided the dog's movement to ensure he didn't slip on the wet pavement. Bruno cooperated perfectly, walking slowly but steadily from the car to the building. The little bell on his collar chimed softly with each step, a gentle sound that somehow made the whole process feel more hopeful. Inside the clinic, the atmosphere was calm and professional. The waiting area was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows and the soft murmur of voices from the examination rooms. Dr. Hassan led them directly to an examination room rather than making them wait in the main area. "Given the circumstances," she explained, "I think it's better to get him settled somewhere quiet right away." The examination room was small but well equipped with a stainless steel table, cabinets full of medical supplies, and charts on the walls showing various animal anatomical diagrams. Bruno looked around with interest, but no apparent anxiety. "Can you tell me what happened?" Dr. Hassan asked as she began her initial examination of Bruno. Amara found herself telling the entire story, from their morning walk to the soccer ball, to the improvised rescue to the wall collapse that had ultimately saved Bruno's life. Dr. Hassan listened with the kind of focused attention that medical professionals develop, asking occasional clarifying questions, but mostly just taking in the information. "And this injury happened during the initial fall?" she asked, examining the cut on Bruno's leg. "We think so," Miller replied. "There was debris and rough concrete in the excavation. He could have been cut by any number of things." Dr. Hassan nodded and continued her examination, checking Bruno's eyes, ears, and mouth, listening to his heart and lungs, and gently probing his abdomen for signs of internal injury. "He's in remarkably good condition considering what he's been through," she said after several minutes. "The cut is the main concern. It's fairly deep and will definitely need stitches, but everything else looks normal." "Is he going to be okay?" Arian asked quietly from his position, sitting in a chair against the wall. Dr. Hassan smiled at him. "He's going to be just fine. Dogs are very resilient, and this one seems particularly strong and healthy." But then her expression became more serious as she continued examining Bruno's collar and checking for identification. "I can see there's a tag, but it's quite worn," she said, trying to read the information. "Do you know anything about his ownership situation?" "We just met him this morning," Amara explained. "He seemed friendly and well cared for, but we don't know where he lives or who owns him." Dr. Hassan nodded and reached for a small electronic device. "Well, let's see if he's microchipped. That would give us definitive information about his owner." She ran the microchip scanner over Bruno's neck and shoulders, and after a moment, the device beeped. "There's a chip," she announced. "Let me look up the information." As Dr. Hassan accessed the microchip database on her computer, the room fell quiet except for the continued sound of rain against the windows. Everyone seemed to sense that they were about to learn something important about Bruno's identity and background. After a few minutes of typing and clicking, Dr. Hassan's expression changed. "This is interesting," she said, reading from her computer screen. "The microchip is registered to a man named David Ahmad. But according to this database, Mr. Ahmad was listed as deceased over a year ago." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Bruno wasn't just a lost dog. He was a dog who had lost his owner. "What does that mean for him?" Marcus asked. "What happens to dogs when their owners die?" "It depends, Doctor," Hassan replied. "Sometimes family members take them, sometimes they go to shelters, sometimes they just end up as strays." She continued reading from the database entry. It says here that Mr. Ahmad was a paramedic with the city fire department. The emergency contact listed is the fire station where he worked. The information added new layers to Bruno's story. He wasn't just any stray dog. He had belonged to a first responder, someone who had dedicated his life to helping others in emergencies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Bruno had ended up in his own emergency situation. "Should we contact the fire station?" Omar asked. "I think that would be a good idea, Doctor," Hassan agreed. They might know what happened to Bruno after Mr. Ahmad passed away, or they might know family members who would want to be reunited with him. But even as they discussed the next steps, Amara found herself looking at the interaction between Bruno and Arian. The dog had positioned himself as close as possible to her son, and Arian was unconsciously stroking Bruno's ears while the adults talked. There was clearly a bond forming between them, something that went beyond the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. And watching them together, Amara couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they found Bruno's rightful home. Outside, the storm continued to intensify, with thunder rolling overhead and lightning illuminating the clinic windows. But inside the small examination room, the atmosphere felt safe and peaceful, like the calm center of the storm, where injured animals could heal and lost souls could find their way home. Dr. Hassan prepared to start cleaning and stitching Bruno's wound, gathering supplies from the cabinets around the examination room. "This is going to take about 30 minutes, she explained. "I'll need to sedate him lightly to keep him still during the procedure." "Will that hurt him?" Orion asked, his voice filled with concern. "Not at all, Doctor," Hassan assured him. "It's just like taking a little nap. He'll wake up feeling much better." As the veterinarian prepared the mild sedative, she continued talking about Bruno's microchip information. "I'm going to call the fire station after we finish the procedure. They should be able to tell us more about what happened to Bruno after his owner passed away." But there was something in her tone that suggested she was worried about what they might discover. Dogs who ended up as strays after their owners died often had complicated stories, sometimes sad ones. Miller, who had been quietly observing the medical preparation, suddenly spoke up. "Dr. Hassan, regardless of what we find out about his background, I want to make sure all of his medical expenses are covered. My construction company will take full responsibility." "That's very generous, Doctor," Hassan replied. "But are you sure your company will approve that expense?" Miller's expression hardened slightly. "If they don't, I'll pay for it myself. This happened because our site wasn't properly secured. It's the right thing to do." Amara found herself impressed by Miller's willingness to take personal responsibility. When she'd first encountered him at the construction site, he'd seemed like an angry bureaucrat, more concerned with liability than with Bruno's welfare. But his actions since then had revealed someone with a strong moral compass who was willing to put his money where his mouth was. The sedative began to take effect, and Bruno's breathing became deeper and more relaxed. His eyes remained open, but took on a dreamy, unfocused quality that indicated the medication was working. "Perfect," Dr. Hassan said, beginning to clean the wound on Bruno's leg. "This shouldn't take too long." As she worked, she continued talking to keep everyone, especially Arian, informed about what she was doing. "First, I clean out any dirt or debris from the cut. Then I'll put in the stitches to help the edges of the skin grow back together. Finally, I'll bandage it to keep it clean while it heals." Arian watched the procedure with intense fascination, asking occasional questions that showed he was following every detail. "Why do you use that kind of thread?" he asked, pointing to the suture material. "It's special thread that dissolves by itself as the wound heals," Dr. Hassan explained. "That way, Bruno won't need to come back to have the stitches removed." "Smart," Arian said approvingly. Marcus had been standing near the window, watching the storm outside. "This weather is getting really intense," he said. "I'm not sure it's safe to drive in this." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the building, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that lit up the entire examination room. "You're welcome to wait here until it passes," Dr. Hassan offered. "We have a comfortable waiting area, and I always keep the clinic open during severe weather in case there are emergency calls." It was a practical offer that made sense for everyone's safety. but Amara found herself thinking about more than just the weather. "Dr. Hassan," she said carefully, "when you call the fire station about Bruno's owner, would it be possible for us to be here for that conversation? I know we're just strangers who happened to help him today, but—" She trailed off, not sure how to express what she was feeling. Over the course of just a few hours, she and Aryan had become emotionally invested in Bruno's welfare. The idea of just dropping him off at the clinic and walking away felt wrong somehow. "Of course," Dr. Hassan said, understanding immediately. "You've been through this whole experience, with him. You have a right to know how his story ends." But Aryan, who had been quietly watching the stitching procedure, suddenly looked up with an expression of confusion. "Story not ending?" he said simply. "Story starting?" His comment caught everyone off guard. In the context of everything that had happened, the rescue, the medical treatment, the search for Bruno's background, it felt like they were reaching the conclusion of an adventure. But Aryan seemed to see something different. "What do you mean, baby?" Amara asked. Aryan looked at Bruno, still drowsy from sedation, but with his eyes tracking the conversation around him. "Bruno was lost," he said slowly, working out his thoughts. "Now Bruno found us, but still need home." It was such a clear, simple assessment of the situation that it left the adults momentarily speechless. In their focus on the immediate crisis, getting Bruno medical attention and identifying his background, they had been thinking in terms of solving a problem. But Aryan was thinking in terms of Bruno's ongoing needs. "You're absolutely right," Miller said after a moment. "Even if we find out what happened after his owner died, that doesn't necessarily mean he has a good home to go back to." Dr. Hassan finished the last stitch and began applying a waterproof bandage to Bruno's leg. "There," she said with satisfaction. "That should heal nicely. He'll need to take it easy for a week or so, but there shouldn't be any permanent damage." Bruno's eyes were starting to clear as the sedative wore off, and he lifted his head slightly to look around the room. When he saw Aryan, his tail gave a weak but definite wag. "He's waking up," Aryan observed unnecessarily, moving his chair closer to the examination table. "The sedative was very mild," Dr. Hassan explained. "He'll be fully alert within another 15 or 20 minutes." As they waited for Bruno to fully recover, Dr. Hassan pulled out her phone to call the fire station. "I think this is a good time to get some answers about his background." She dialed the number listed in the microchip database and put the call on speaker so everyone could hear the conversation. "City Fire Station 12, this is Captain Rodriguez." "Hello, Captain Rodriguez. This is Dr. Hassan from Willowbrook Animal Hospital. I'm calling about a German Shepherd that was brought in today. His microchip shows he belonged to David Ahmad, who worked at your station." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Captain Rodriguez spoke again, his voice carried a note of sadness. "Bruno," he said immediately. "You found Bruno." The fact that he knew the dog's name instantly told them everything about how much Bruno had meant to the firefighters at Station 12. "Yes, Bruno," Dr. Hassan confirmed. "Some good Samaritans brought him in after he was injured in an accident. Can you tell me what happened to him after Mr. Ahmad passed away?" Captain Rodriguez sighed deeply. "That's a complicated story. David didn't have any family, and his will didn't make specific provisions for Bruno. We tried to find him a good home, but he kept running away from wherever we placed him. He seemed to be looking for David, you know? Dogs don't understand that their people aren't coming back." The explanation was heartbreaking, but not entirely surprising. Dogs were known for their loyalty, and the loss of a beloved owner could be traumatic for them. "How long has he been missing?" Dr. Hassan asked. "About 3 months now," Captain Rodriguez replied. "We've been keeping an eye out for him, putting up flyers, checking with local shelters. But he seemed to just disappear." Miller leaned closer to the phone. "Captain, this is Jake Miller. I'm the site supervisor for the construction project where Bruno was found. Do you think he's been living rough all this time?" "It's possible," Rodriguez said. "Bruno was always a resourceful dog. David used to bring him to the station sometimes, and Bruno knew how to find food and water, how to stay safe. But 3 months on the streets is a long time for any animal." Aryan had been listening to this conversation with growing distress. The idea that Bruno had been alone and homeless for months clearly bothered him deeply. "Why did he run away?" Aryan asked, speaking directly to the phone. Captain Rodriguez's voice became gentler when he heard the child's question. "Well, little guy, I think Bruno was confused and sad. When dogs lose their person, sometimes they go looking for them. Bruno probably thought if he searched long enough, he'd find David again. But David can't come back, Arian said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes have about difficult truths. No, he can't, Rodriguez agreed sadly. David died in a car accident while he was off duty. It was very sudden. Bruno never got to say goodbye. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. Bruno's story was even sadder than they had imagined. Not only had he lost his beloved owner, but he'd spent months as a homeless stray, probably never understanding why David had abandoned him. Dr. Hassan broke the silence. Captain Rodriguez, what happens now? Does the fire department want to take custody of Bruno again? There was another pause before Rodriguez answered. Honestly, Doctor, Hassan, we're not sure that's the best solution. We tried 3 different placements, and he ran away from all of them. We care about Bruno, but we're not equipped to be a permanent animal shelter. What about a regular animal shelter? Marcus asked. That's an option, Rodriguez said reluctantly. But Bruno is 6 years old, and he has some behavioral issues related to his trauma. Older dogs with problems don't always get adopted easily. The implication was clear. Bruno could end up spending the rest of his life in a shelter, or worse. Amara found herself looking at her son, who was now sitting on the floor next to the examination table where Bruno was lying. The dog had lowered his head so that Arian could pet him more easily, and the two of them seemed completely comfortable with each other. Captain Rodriguez, she said carefully, if someone wanted to adopt Bruno, what would that process involve? Are you thinking about it? Rodriguez asked, and there was hope in his voice. I don't know, Amara answered honestly. We just met him today, but she looked around the room at the group of people who had come together to save Bruno's life. Miller, who was willing to pay for expensive veterinary care out of his own pocket. Marcus, who had driven through a dangerous storm to get Bruno medical attention. Omar and Leah and Sarah, who had stayed to help, despite being complete strangers. Dr. Hassan, who was keeping her clinic open during severe weather to make sure Bruno received proper care. All of these people had been willing to go out of their way for one injured dog. Surely there was a way to ensure that Bruno found a permanent home where he would be loved and cared for. The thing is, Amara continued, I live in an apartment. I work full-time. I have a 5-year-old son. I don't know if I can provide what a dog like Bruno needs. What does Bruno need? Arian asked, looking up from where he was petting the dog. It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of the matter. Bruno needs someone who will love him and not give up on him, Captain Rodriguez said from the phone. Someone who understands that he's been through trauma and might need patience while he adjusts to a new home. And someone who can give him enough exercise and mental stimulation, Dr. Hassan added. German Shepherds are working dogs. They need jobs to do. What kind of jobs? Arian asked with interest. Dr. Hassan smiled. Well, some German Shepherds work with police or firefighters. Some help people who can't see or hear well. Some just help families by being good guard dogs and companions. Bruno could help our family, Arian said thoughtfully. He could be my friend, and he could make sure we're safe. Amara felt her heart squeeze at her son's innocent certainty that Bruno belonged with them. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with pet ownership, especially for a dog with Bruno's complicated background. It's not that simple, baby, she said gently. Taking care of a dog is a big responsibility. It costs money for food and medical care. Dogs need to be walked every day, even when the weather is bad. They need training and attention. I could help, Arian said immediately. I could give him food and water. I could walk with him. I could teach him about my trucks. Despite the seriousness of the conversation, several people in the room smiled at Arian's offer to teach Bruno about toy trucks, but Miller surprised everyone by speaking up with a practical suggestion. What if it didn't have to be just your responsibility? He asked. Amara. What if Bruno could have a whole community of people looking out for him? What do you mean? Dr. Hassan asked. Miller looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had all contributed to Bruno's rescue. I mean, look what happened today. None of us knew each other this morning, but we all came together to help Bruno when he needed it. What if we could formalize that somehow? Like a shared custody arrangement, Marcus asked. Not exactly, Miller said, his idea taking shape as he spoke. More like a support network. If Amara and Arian want to be Bruno's primary family, but they have concerns about the practical aspects, maybe the rest of us could help with those. Omar, who had been quiet during most of the phone conversation, suddenly perked up with interest. That's actually not a bad idea. I work from home most days. I could help with walking and exercise. I live just a few blocks from Amara, Marcus added. I jog every morning anyway. Bruno could come with me. Dr. Hassan looked thoughtful. And as his veterinarian, I could work out a payment plan for his ongoing medical care, maybe even provide some services at cost. The fire department would love to help too, Captain Rodriguez said from the phone. David always talked about how much Bruno meant to him. If we could help Bruno find a good home, it would mean a lot to all of us. Amara found herself overwhelmed by the generosity of people who had been complete strangers just a few hours ago. But she also felt the pressure of making a decision that would affect not just her and Arian, but Bruno's entire future. I need to think about this, she said finally. It's not a decision I can make on impulse, even with all of your support. Of course, Dr. Hassan said understandingly. This is a big commitment. Why don't you take some time to consider it? But Arian, who had been listening to the entire conversation while continuing to pet Bruno, suddenly looked up with an expression of absolute certainty. Mama, he said in his clear, quiet voice, Bruno already decided. Everyone turned to look at him, not understanding what he meant. Arian pointed to Bruno, who was now fully awake and alert from the sedation. The dog was lying calmly on the examination table, but his eyes were fixed on Arian with an intensity that was unmistakable. He's not looking for his old person anymore, Arian explained with the wisdom that children sometimes possess about emotional truths. He's looking at his new person. You mean he's chosen you? Amara asked softly. Arian nodded solemnly. And I choose him too. The simple declaration hung in the air like a challenge to all the adult complications and concerns that had been raised about dog ownership and responsibility and practical considerations. Sometimes, Amara realized, the most important decisions weren't made with spreadsheets and careful planning. Sometimes they were made with the heart, in moments when you recognized that your life had just changed in ways you never expected. She looked at her son, sitting on the floor next to a dog he'd helped rescue, both of them seeming absolutely certain that they belonged together. Then she looked around the room at the group of strangers who had become friends, all of them willing to help make this unlikely partnership work. Finally, she looked at Bruno himself, with his intelligent brown eyes and the little bell on his collar that had chimed through every moment of this extraordinary day. Okay, she said quietly, let's bring Bruno home. The words were simple, but they felt like the most important thing she'd ever said. Bruno's tail began to wag, and the little bell on his collar chimed like a celebration. But the celebration was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the room freeze. The sharp crack of lightning striking very close to the clinic, followed immediately by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundation. That was close, Marcus said, moving away from the window. Dr. Hassan checked her computer screen and frowned. The power just flickered. If we lose electricity, the backup generator will kick in, but it's not ideal for completing Bruno's treatment. As if on cue, the lights dimmed for a moment before returning to full brightness. The storm outside was reaching its peak intensity, with rain hammering against the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of pebbles being thrown at the glass. Maybe we should stay here a little longer, Amara said, looking out at the sheets of rain visible through the clinic windows. It doesn't seem safe to take Bruno out in this weather, especially with his fresh stitches. Dr. Hassan nodded in agreement. That's probably wise. The bandage is waterproof, but I'd rather not test it against a downpour like this. Bruno, meanwhile, seemed completely unbothered by the storm raging outside. His attention was focused entirely on Arian, who was now sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the examination table. The dog had carefully positioned himself so his head was resting near Arian's lap, and his eyes never left the boy's face. I think he really has chosen you, Miller observed, watching the interaction between dog and child with something approaching amazement. Dogs are excellent judges of character, Dr. Hassan added. They can sense things about people that we might miss. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the phone speaker, which Dr. Hassan had left connected. If you're really serious about adopting Bruno, there are a few things you should know about his background with David. What kind of things? Amara asked. Well, David didn't just work as a paramedic. He also volunteered with a program that brought therapy dogs to hospitals and nursing homes. Bruno was trained for that work. This revelation added yet another layer to Bruno's story. He wasn't just a pet who had lost his owner. He was a working dog who had been trained to comfort people in distress. That explains a lot, Doctor, Hassan said thoughtfully. His behavior today, the way he responded to everyone's stress during the rescue, that's specialized training. What kind of training? Arian asked with interest. Captain Rodriguez's voice became warmer as he explained. Therapy dogs learn to stay calm in chaotic situations. They learn to read human emotions and respond appropriately. They're taught to be gentle with children and elderly people, and to provide comfort when people are scared or sad. So when Bruno stayed calm during the rescue, even though he was terrified himself, that was his training kicking in, Marcus asked. Partly, Rodriguez confirmed. But it was also just Bruno being Bruno. David used to say that some dogs are born with the temperament for therapy work, and Bruno was one of them. Amara found herself thinking about this new information. If Bruno was trained as a therapy dog, that could actually be an advantage for Arian, who sometimes struggled in social situations and might benefit from having a calm, specially trained companion. But it also raised questions about whether Bruno would be happy in a regular family setting after being accustomed to working life. Captain Rodriguez, she said, do you think Bruno would be satisfied just being a family pet? Or would he need to continue doing therapy work to be fulfilled? That's a great question, Rodriguez replied. David always said that Bruno loved his work, but he also loved just being a regular dog at home. The nice thing about therapy dog training is that it makes them excellent family companions too. Dr. Hassan began cleaning up her surgical instruments while she listened to the conversation. Actually, if you're interested, there are several facilities in this area that use therapy dogs. If Bruno is already certified, you might be able to continue his work on a volunteer basis. Would you want to do that? Amara asked Arian. Would you like to help Bruno visit people who need comfort? Arian considered this question with his characteristic seriousness. Bruno makes me feel better, he said finally. Maybe he could make other people feel better too. It was such a mature and empathetic response that it left the adults in the room momentarily speechless. Arian seemed to instinctively understand the concept of therapy work and how Bruno's special abilities could benefit others. The storm outside was beginning to show signs of weakening. The lightning was less frequent, and while the rain was still heavy, it no longer had the driving intensity of a few minutes earlier. I think we might be able to leave soon, Omar said, checking his phone for weather updates. The worst of it seems to be passing. But Dr. Hassan held up a hand. Before you go, there's something else I need to check on Bruno's microchip record. Sometimes there are additional notes or information that don't show up in the basic search. She turned back to her computer and began typing, accessing what appeared to be a more detailed database. After a few minutes of clicking and scrolling, her expression changed. This is interesting, she said, reading from the screen. There's a note here from David Ahmad, added about 6 months before he died. What kind of note? Amara asked. Dr. Hassan read directly from the screen. Bruno has been struggling with anxiety since we moved to a new apartment. The building doesn't allow pets, so we've been staying temporarily with friends. If anything happens to me, please find Bruno a family with children. He's happiest when he has young people to care for. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this information. David Ahmad had apparently foreseen the possibility that something might happen to him, and he had specifically requested that Bruno be placed with a family that included children. It's like he knew, Orion said quietly. Knew what, baby? Amara asked. That Bruno would find me, Orion replied with the absolute certainty that children sometimes have about things that adults find mysterious. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the phone speaker again. That note explains why Bruno kept running away from the homes we found for him. We placed him with 3 different families, but none of them had children. He was looking for what David wanted him to have, Miller said, understanding dawning on his face. Dr. Hassan continued reading from the computer screen. There's more here. David wrote, Bruno's collar has a special bell that belonged to my daughter Sarah, who died when she was 5 years old. The bell was from a toy she loved. Bruno wore it during our therapy visits to the children's hospital because it seemed to calm the young patients. Please make sure whoever takes Bruno understands the significance of the bell. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The little bell that had been chiming throughout their entire adventure wasn't just a decorative accessory. It was a memorial to a child who had died, and it had been used to comfort other children during their most difficult moments. Amara looked at Arian, who was still gently petting Bruno's head. The bell on Bruno's collar was silent now, but she could see it gleaming softly in the clinic's fluorescent lights. "David lost a daughter," she said quietly, the full tragedy of the story becoming clear. "Yes," Captain Rodriguez confirmed, his voice heavy with sadness. "Sarah died of leukemia when she was just 5 years old. David got Bruno partly to help him cope with the grief, but Bruno ended up helping a lot of other people too. That's why he wanted Bruno to go to a family with children," Dr. Hassan said, understanding the emotional logic. He wanted Bruno to have the chance to love and protect a child again. Arian looked up from petting Bruno, his dark eyes serious and thoughtful. "The bell is from his little girl?" "Yes," Amara said softly. "From a little girl who would have been about your age if she had lived." Arian carefully reached toward Bruno's collar, his small fingers touching the bell with the reverence of someone who understood its importance. The bell gave one soft chime at his touch. "She would want Bruno to be happy," Arian said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess about death and love and the connections between living beings. "I think you're absolutely right," Captain Rodriguez said from the phone. The storm outside had definitely begun to weaken. The thunder was more distant now, and while rain was still falling, it had decreased to a steady shower rather than the torrential downpour of earlier. "I think it's safe to head home now," Dr. Hassan said, checking the weather on her phone. "Bruno's stitches should be fine, as long as we keep him reasonably dry." But as they prepared to leave the clinic, Amara realized there were still practical details that needed to be worked out. Bruno would need food, a bed, toys, a leash, all the supplies that came with dog ownership. "Don't worry about any of that tonight," Miller said, seeming to read her thoughts. "Tomorrow, I'll make sure you get everything Bruno needs. Tonight, just focus on getting him settled." "I have some basic supplies at home," Dr. Hassan added. "Food, a collar and leash, even a dog bed. I keep emergency supplies for situations exactly like this." The generosity of these relative strangers continued to amaze Amara, but perhaps more importantly, their willingness to help made the enormous step she was taking feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Captain Rodriguez spoke from the phone one more time. "Ma'am, I know we haven't met in person, but from everything I've heard today, I think David would be very happy knowing that Bruno found his way to you and your son." "Thank you," Amara said, feeling the weight of responsibility but also the warmth of community support. "That means a lot." Dr. Hassan gathered the promised supplies, a bag of high-quality dog food, a sturdy leash and collar, and a medium-sized dog bed that would fit in Amara's apartment. "Bruno should take it easy for the next week while his stitches heal," she instructed. "Short walks, no running or jumping, and keep the bandage dry. I'll want to see him again in 5 days to check on the healing." As they prepared to transfer Bruno from the examination table to the floor, Arian stood up and looked seriously at the dog. "Bruno," he said in his clear, quiet voice, "you're coming home with us now. Is that okay?" Bruno's response was immediate and unmistakable. His tail began wagging so hard that his entire body wiggled, and he let out a soft woof of agreement. "I think that's a yes," Marcus said, laughing. Getting Bruno into Marcus's SUV for the return trip was much easier than it had been earlier. The dog seemed to understand that this time, the car ride was taking him to his new home, rather than just to another temporary stop. Arian insisted on sitting in the back seat with Bruno, rather than in his car seat. And after some negotiation, Amara agreed, as long as they drove slowly and carefully. The drive through the rain-soaked streets was quiet and peaceful. The storm had washed the air clean, and despite the late hour, the world outside looked fresh and renewed. "I still can't believe everything that happened today," Omar said, as Marcus navigated toward Amara's apartment building. "It does seem pretty incredible," Amara agreed. "This morning, I had no idea my life was about to change so dramatically." "Do you think it was just coincidence?" Miller asked. "Bruno ending up at that construction site right when you and Arian were walking by?" Arian, who had been quietly stroking Bruno's ears, looked up at the adults with the expression of someone who found their confusion puzzling. "Not coincidence," he said simply. "Bruno was looking for us, and we were looking for him. We just didn't know yet." It was such a clear, confident statement that it left the adults with nothing to add. Sometimes, Amara thought, 5-year-olds understood things about destiny and connection that grown-ups spent years trying to figure out. When they reached Amara's apartment building, the small group worked together to get Bruno settled for his first night in his new home. The dog explored the apartment with interest, but not anxiety, sniffing at corners and investigating the layout while staying close to Arian. "He's making himself at home already," Dr. Hassan observed as Bruno settled down on his new bed in the living room. But when it came time for Arian's bedtime, Bruno surprised everyone by following the boy to his bedroom and lying down on the floor beside Arian's bed. "I think he's taking his guardian duties seriously," Miller said with a smile. As the group of new friends prepared to leave, they exchanged contact information and made plans to check in regularly on Bruno's adjustment to his new life. "This isn't the end," Omar said as they said their goodbyes. "This feels like the beginning of something important." "A community," Leah agreed. "All of us connected because of Bruno." After everyone had left, Amara sat on her couch and looked around her apartment, which suddenly felt different with Bruno's presence filling it. The dog was lying on his bed, but his eyes were alert and watchful, clearly still getting used to his new surroundings. Arian appeared in the living room in his pajamas, carrying his toy dump truck. "Mama," he said, "can I show Bruno something?" "Of course, baby." Arian approached Bruno's bed and sat down cross-legged beside it. He held up his dump truck, the same toy that had played such a crucial role in the rescue effort earlier that day. "Bruno," he said softly, "this truck helped save you, but I want you to have it now, to remember that you're safe." He placed the small yellow truck beside Bruno's bed, and the dog immediately sniffed it with interest. Then, in a gesture that made Amara's eyes fill with tears, Bruno gently licked the truck once before settling his head down next to it. "I think he understands," Amara said quietly. "He knows it's important," Arian agreed. As Amara tucked her son into bed, she could hear Bruno settling down in the living room, the faint chime of his bell marking his movements as he got comfortable in his new home. "Mama," Arian said as she turned off his bedroom light, "I'm glad we found Bruno." "I'm glad too, baby. Very glad." "Do you think David's little girl is happy that Bruno found us?" Amara considered the question carefully. "I think she would be very happy knowing that Bruno has a little boy to love and protect again." "Good," Arian said, settling under his covers. "I want to take good care of Bruno, like David did." As Amara made her own preparations for bed, she reflected on the extraordinary day that had changed their lives so completely. This morning, she and Arian had been a family of 2. Tonight, they were a family of 3, with a beautiful, brave German shepherd who carried the love of 2 lost children in his gentle heart. The last sound she heard before falling asleep was the soft chime of Bruno's bell as he got up to check on Arian one more time before settling down for the night. In the weeks that followed, Bruno's integration into their family exceeded everyone's expectations. The community support network that had formed during the rescue continued to provide help and friendship. Omar became a regular walking companion, Miller ensured that all of Bruno's needs were met, and Dr. Hassan provided ongoing medical care. But perhaps most importantly, Arian and Bruno developed a bond that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The quiet, observant 5-year-old and the gentle, protective German shepherd seemed to understand each other in ways that transcended the usual relationship between child and pet. Bruno returned to therapy work, with Arian accompanying him on visits to the children's hospital where David and Sarah had once spent so much time. The little bell on Bruno's collar continued to provide comfort to young patients, just as it had years before. And every morning, Amara would wake to find Arian and Bruno in the living room, the boy playing with his remaining trucks while the dog watched protectively. The yellow dump truck that had saved Bruno's life sitting in a place of honor beside Bruno's bed. Sometimes the most important moments in life came disguised as ordinary Tuesday mornings, Amara realized. Sometimes salvation arrived in the form of a scared dog and a brave child, and a community of strangers who chose to care. And sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could hear love itself in the gentle chime of a small bell that carried the memory of one lost child and the promise of hope for another. The story that began with a rescue had become something much larger, a testament to the connections that bind us all together, the courage that lives in the smallest hearts, and the healing power of love that finds a way, against all odds, to make broken things whole again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists in the world. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary moments hidden in ordinary days. And comment below to tell us where you're listening from and how animals have changed your life.